In this section, we're going to go in and actually do the installation of the database. Previous episodes, we went in and looked at what it took to load the Linux operating system and then get the database binaries up and running and available to do the install. So to review, we started out with the Oracle Learning Library, the 12C 2-day DBA tutorial series. We did a begin tutorial, which brought us into the overview. The overview talked about the universal installer and what's needed to actually set everything up. We're using a virtual machine with 2 virtual CPUs, 4 gig of memory, and 40 gig of hard disk. At this point, we will do the basic install. If we walk through this, the first thing we're going to do is uncheck wish to receive security updates. Then we're going to skip the software updates and create and configure a database. We're going to do a server class database, single instance rather than rack. We're going to do a typical install rather than advanced install. We'll add the SID, the passwords, and then check do not create a container database. And once we've got that, it's basically starting the installation. So let's go to our database instance. One thing that's changed from the previous is instead of having the UL1 mounted on /media/UL1, we went in and said let's physically put it, and we did that by telling it this is the SDD drive. We want to mount it on UL1. It's an ext4 file system. We're going to use the default mount options and then make it the last thing we mount when we start the system. The way we figured out it was an SDD4 was going into the System Tools Disk Utility, looking at the 43 gig hard drive and looking at the device's SDD. We did that because when we formatted the file system, we formatted the whole volume as opposed to formatting and partitioning the drive. If we partition the drive, we would be looking at SDD1 or SDD2 as opposed to the whole drive, but for this example, we're doing the whole drive as a volume. So if we go into the UL1 drive, we do the run installer, and the run installer is going to launch the Oracle install interface. This is the universal installer that we're going to go in and do. When this goes out, it actually looks at the host name, and if it can't find the host name, it will stop. In the previous example, we had to go in and modify the etc sys config/network to change the host name, and then the etc hosts to define the IP address for the host. We also gave it a static IP address because the database doesn't like being on a DHCP. The IP address changes and it causes problems with the listener. So we changed it to static IP, we gave it a different host name, we made sure the host name mapped to the IP address that we assigned to, and it should come up with the universal installer as we expect here in a minute. So first thing we do, we don't want to receive the security update notices, and that's okay. We're going to create and configure a base database. We're going to do a server class rather than a desktop class. The key difference is there are more options in the advanced, but for what we're doing, this is good enough. Rather than doing a cluster, we could do a rack node, which would allow us to fail over to a second node once we have a second rack node 1. We could do this as part of a rack cluster, but instead we're going to do a single instance database. We're going to do a typical install just to do it quick and easy the first time. It's going to assume these are the directories that we're trying to store everything into. We have the option of Enterprise Edition, and that's it. I'm going to use a simple password. It's going to complain about it, but that's okay. And we're going to turn off the container database because we're going to do just a straight database. We're going to continue even though the passwords are simple. That's okay. It's going to go out and look at the operating system and see if there are any issues or problems, and yes, there are issues and problems. Typically it's pretty straightforward. If there are packages that we need to add, what we do is we come up to a window and say we tell it to go do an install of that library. And we're having problems getting to the public Yum server. That could cause problems for the install. Typically what I wanted to show was it should come back and say that this package is already installed. We don't need to worry about it. But in this example, it found that we do need the libcap. So we're going to download it and install it. We're going to skip those steps for now. What I wanted to look at is do the fix and change. And what the fix and change is it should go in and try to change the OS kernel parameters. So if we do a execution of the run fixup and run it as root, which we did with the sudo command, it will now go in and say, did we change everything? And the only thing it's missing now are these libraries. We're going to actually say ignore these because I know that the KSH and the GCC C++ are both installed. These are typically versions that it's complaining about, so we're just going to ignore it. And then we say go ahead and install, and it should proceed and install. This will take about 10 minutes to do all of the installation and all of the execution. Rather than having you watch everything, I'm going to pause and come back when something interesting comes back on the screen. So after a few minutes, we get to the point where we're ready to execute the root scripts. Notice we've been watching this about 4 minutes. So the first thing we have to do is modify the read-write permissions for the group, and that's done by executing the aura instroot.sh. And then the next is to set up the user local bin directory. Pretty straightforward. We're now done with setting up the root scripts, and the next thing it's going to do is to actually go create a database, and it'll do that by popping up the DBCA screen to create a default database. In the database creation, the first thing it does is it creates the listener, and then it creates the database instance. The listener is pretty straightforward since we've already manually checked that. The DBCA will come up and create the database files, create the templates, and then start all of the processes and scripts to run the database. This should take a minute or two, since this is a sample database in a very small instance that we're running on. So the database is finished installing. It comes up and tells us that we do have a database admin, the database config assistant, that allows us to come in and manage through the DB console. We can go in and change passwords. I'm going to leave the passwords the same. We just need to remember that the Enterprise Manager is on port 5500. And with this, we are done with the database. Now, if we want